Alberta says it will act as the proponent, at least initially, to develop a major projects application for a pipeline that would run to the northwest coast of British Columbia. Former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney is pushing back against British Columbia's opposition to the new pipeline, and he joins me here now. Jason Kenney, good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be here.
Before we get into what you're saying about David Eby, I want to get your thoughts on what Danielle Smith has done here. She's the proponent in the initial stages in the hopes of breaking the logjam, as she says, to get the private sector in. Do you think this can work?
Yeah, it can. It's going to be a long haul, but I think it's a strong leadership on the part of the Alberta government to fill the void. Here's the problem. You know, David Eby is smart enough to know that there is no current private sector proponent because the current policy setting of the federal government makes that impossible. Like, he's been totally disingenuous. He's smart enough to know that with the tanker ban, with the emissions cap on the oil sands, which means the oil sands companies cannot do any significant new greenfield development to increase production by 1 million barrels a day, let's say, and with C-69 continuing to be a point of huge uncertainty around approvals, that no proponent's going to come to the table after TC Energy lost something like $1 billion on the Energy East process that got bogged down in regulatory uncertainty, right. And Enbridge lost $1 billion on the initial Northern Gateway proposal. So I think the government of Alberta is doing the right thing to step in. And by the way, you know, there's a precedent for this in a way, which is that in the early 1970s, Peter Lougheed, who was very much a free market guy, stepped in, created a Crown Corporation, the Alberta Energy Corporation, to help capitalize the early oil sands developments and technology because he understood the enormous value to Alberta, but that it wasn't yet economically feasible.
Right. But, you know, the arguments you laid out as to why there is no private sector proponent, we heard that from the CEO of Enbridge in a speech today. We heard that from Premier Danielle Smith. Her acting as a proponent, though, doesn't change that reality, right? So,
but it's a government that's willing to take the risk. And by the way, there's another precedent here, which is the Trudeau government buying the Trans Mountain project from Kinder Morgan. Now, I argue that, as do many others, that never should have had to happen. Like, Kinder Morgan should have had the clear regulatory runway to capitalize the project and take on board that risk for their shareholders, but they didn't. And so the government of Canada stepped in and de-risked it. So here's the point. These projects are of such enormous value. When the Prime Minister is talking about nation-building projects to reduce our dependence on the United States, there are no projects that can produce anything like the kind of wealth, export value, job creation, and revenue, tax revenue, as these oil sands projects. If you get a 1 million barrel a day pipeline built at $70 oil, roughly average price, that's like $30 billion of sales a year. To put that in context, that's the exports of the entire Canadian lumber industry, and that doesn't even include the huge multi-billion-dollar investments in upstream development.
Right. Okay. You don't tweet often, but when you do, you tweet at length, and you did that today. You did make this lumber point, but you also said David Eby is objectively a much bigger threat to Confederation and to the rule of law than Alberta separatists. You talked about the law being clear, as we learned with TMX, but you talk about a conversation I guess you had with the late John Horgan, where you said that his party, he told you, included a mud hut wing of green extremists, which I took to include Eby, and you called the Premier of British Columbia an ideological zealot who's not on Team Canada. That's a lot, Jason Kenney. I mean, but why go there? I mean, what does that do to this?
Well, I was watching Eby pretending to be part of Team Canada, be Captain Canada, the guy who's given the Chinese shipyard this subsidized by the Chinese government and the People's Liberation Army, these shipping jobs. He found himself in a convenience store in Tokyo when the first ministers were meeting about creating one Canadian economy, knocking down trade barriers. And now he's standing in the way of the single largest potential project to create wealth and diversify exports that is on offer in the Canadian economy when he has absolutely no legal or constitutional authority to do so. He is a lawyer, but he is performatively acting like a demagogue right now. He knows that the Constitution, Section 9210 of the 1867 Constitution Act, gives the federal government exclusive authority over interprovincial infrastructure, including pipelines, as reaffirmed unanimously by both the BC Appeals Court and the Supreme Court of Canada quite recently. And so the reason I say he's a bigger threat, I don't think the Alberta separatists, the hardcore separatists, are actually a serious threat. I think they're a very small minority. But this is a BC Premier using his office to violate and threaten the Constitution and to say to patriotic Albertans and Saskatchewan residents that he's going to try to use his political authority against the clear letter of the Constitution to block provinces from exporting what they produce, which is undermining the entire premise of Confederation as an economic union.
Well, I don't know if he spelled out any specific action that he would take to stop it, other than to point out there is, as a point of fact, no private sector proponent right now for all the reasons that we've discussed, and that he doesn't support the idea. But he's not alone in that, right? We spoke with Marilyn Slett earlier in the show. You know, she's with the Coastal First Nations Great Bear Initiative, sort of the group of First Nations who have land around Prince Rupert. They don't want this either. And there's a duty to consult with them, and they do not want an oil pipeline coming in, and they don't want that added tanker traffic on top of what's already there from LNG.
You know, David, I find it passing strange that the CBC in particular, but also other media outlets, so rarely seem to interview the pro-development First Nations. They seem to get pushed out of the camera, so to speak. The majority of Western Canadian First Nations support responsible resource development, and this was tested on the Trans Mountain expansion. The Supreme Court of Canada upheld a finding of the trial court in BC on that the duty to consult had been properly undertaken, the honour of the Crown was discharged, and that of the 119 proximate or interested Indigenous communities in that project, that 110 of them either supported it or were neutral. So I think I just encourage media to find balanced voices amongst Indigenous communities who are increasingly involved through equity participation and would be the single largest winners in terms of investment, but also employment in a major project of this nature.
Well, look, you know, I take your point that there are, but you know, we've spoken with the NISGA leadership about their LNG proponent. In that very chair, pro-development, pro-pipeline, pro-economic corridor.
Ellis Ross would be a good example.
Well, yes, absolutely. But on the C5 summits, we have had them on the show talking about it. I know there are people in favor of this. There are First Nations in favor of it, but the people whose land would be affected by the pipeline, whose communities would have the end point going into it, they're on the route, right? So they have a say.
There's a lot of possible terminuses on the Northwest BC coast for a project like this. I can tell you, look, as Premier, I created the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation, which was a game changer, providing credit backstop for Indigenous equity participation in major projects. And what we have found is that that's really what the vast majority of First Nations have been looking for, to benefit from the development of these resources, not just to get token marginal benefit agreements, but to actually be co-owners in it. And what I understand Premier Smith is proposing is including Indigenous communities at the very beginning of the process. But that's a mistake that was made in the past, that usually the consultation happened too late. They need to be brought in at the beginning. I think we've all learned that lesson, but I do think this is a responsible step forward.
No, and she made that point last night when we spoke to her on the show. And Wab Kinew, at various points, it was in, I believe, that First Minister's meeting in Saskatoon, where he said, if we get this right on nation building, you can change the lives of some of the poorest children in Canada. So there is an upside there if these things are done right. But there is a conflict in this moment, and Danielle Smith is trying to break the logjam to get a proponent. She's not going to make the proposal until the spring of 2026. As former Premier of Alberta, I mean, what are you watching for between now and then, and how do you think the federal government should respond to this, given that it is heating up a little bit?
Well, very positively, and you know, the Prime Minister has invited the provinces to bring forward priority projects. Let me be blunt, a lot of what I've seen from premiers is just basically a rehashing of their traditional infrastructure lists, highways and tunnels and such, which is all fine. But none of that actually creates tens of billions of dollars of new export revenue, of tax revenue, thousands of permanent private sector jobs. If this is about not just building government infrastructure, but actually expanding the Canadian economy away from dependence on the United States in a major strategic way, then we have to be talking about increasing what is by far Canada's largest export product, and that happens to be our crude oil.
Jason Kenney, former Premier of Alberta. Appreciate the time. Thanks for coming in.
Good to be here.